This video lecture briefly covers Lawson Chapter 2, a discussion of formation of states and states in world history. The basis for international relations theory is the state and an international state system, meaning that states are the primary form of social and political organization, although this is only one form of political community, and a relatively new form at that. We define the state as a particular set of institutions with the authority to govern its territory. While it is the dominant form of political community, the efficacy of the state has been challenged due to some of the failures of states to protect human rights, ensure development, and defend borders, as well as increasing global influence over culture, economics, and politics. As international networks have grown, the traditional divide between domestic and international politics has begun to blur. Among the more critical of the state system, some have argued for a dissolution of the state and favor stronger local or international authority, given the sometimes disastrous outcomes of states. But to understand what a state is, it is important to understand the historical context in which states emerged, and that includes understanding other forms of political organization, as well as philosophical influences on the rationale behind states. States denote a form of political community that adheres to certain customs, rules, and institutions of authority in spite of vast other cultural and linguistic differences. For example, all states have some form of constitution, some legislative or deliberative body, an executive, and police and armed forces, and so on. Specifically, state authorities are the only legitimate wielders of force against their population, and ideally will be the only group using force or violence within the territory. Territory, then, is an important dimension to the modern state. The physical borders of the state comprise the area over which a particular authority exercises legitimate means to protect those borders. Sometimes states are conflated with another form of political and social organization, the nation, and this denotes a group who share common culture, history, language, religion, ethnicity, sometimes, or some other feature of community. Nations do not require territorial boundaries, and you may find some nations spread out over the entire globe. This can create a problem of stateless nations if there is no territory allotted or won by the nation to occupy. This is a problematic concept for Europeans who show a preference for nation states, where only one nation inhabits a state. Examples of stateless nations include Native Americans in the United States, the Roma people in Europe, the Kurds in the Middle East, and the Rohingya Muslims in Southeast Asia. This is related to the question of identity and the strength of states, as stateless nations have sometimes created tensions in former colonies. Ethnic divides can lend themselves to civil unrest and may eventually lead to breakdown of state authority and power. So nations precede states as a major form of political organization, and some nations retain similar features of their pre-state society. Pre-modern societies relied on extended kinship networks with no fixed territory, and their means of production was foraging and hunting. The transformation to more sedentary settlements developed 10,000 years ago due to domestication of animals and agricultural sophistication. Eventually, most small communities became parts of large empires, large-scale political entities made up of smaller communities under a central commanding power, and normally this was achieved through force. These empires were international in that they ranged over large amounts of territories, languages, and cultural practices. The idea of a political community as a philosophical and moral problem is an ancient one that Plato and Aristotle considered. The common form of organization during the Greek Empire was the city-state, also referred to as a polis. In the history of the Peloponnesian War, a writing that is said to form the origins of realist thought, Thucydides recounts the mistrust and self-interest of warring city-states, asserting that no cooperation or agreement could be made between two such entities that were so motivated by power and self-preservation. This philosophy, embraced by realists at the time, was very much a product of the crumbling, warring Greek civilization and reflects the fear and uncertainty of that time period. Aristotle wrote that man was a political animal. Plato, by the way, said we were social animals. And this need for power over others characterizes all relationships for Aristotle. According to his line of thinking, no type of government is universally good. The best government would be one that matches the constitution of society, and for some, especially those that were captured as slaves, a totalitarian emperor was the just form of government. During the Middle Ages, Christian philosophers also provided justification for the need of authority, government, and the state to control humanity's wickedness and sinfulness. This comes from the mind of St. Augustine. Others, like Thomas Aquinas, argued that states had the responsibility to promote the common good. In similar terms, Hinduism, Islam, and Confucianism all purport that there is a need for higher authority to control the worst parts of human instinct. There are certainly echoes of these sentiments in modern politics around the world, even as some states subscribe to the ideas of equality and freedom, a viewpoint held by Stoics in the ancient Roman tradition. So there is a diversity among the traditions that inform the need and the acceptance of states. The modern period, marked by the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the Protestant Reformation, coincides with the emergence of the state system from about the 17th century onwards. The Renaissance period was important for opening up the society to accept knowledge through art, science, and philosophy, and it fostered such important scientific ideas as evolution and natural rights, leading to a growing demand in the world for human rights. In this same period, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau wrote about the state as a form of social contract that emerges for various reasons. For Hobbes, the state government is necessary and should be absolute because humans are inevitably selfish, exploitative, and warlike. For Locke, the state is necessary to protect the natural equality among men. And for Rousseau, the social contract that forms the state creates oppression and alienation if you're not super careful. Finally, one of the biggest philosophical influences on the realist tradition is found in Machiavelli, who wrote The Prince as a handbook to the Medici family for consolidating power in pre-state Italy's warring kingdoms. According to Machiavelli, there were no moral considerations to concern oneself with if one wanted power. They must pursue it ruthlessly and with no restraint in order to assure certain control. Historically, the split in the Christian church between Catholics and Protestants was as important as any philosophical influence on the formation of the state system. The state system, along with the principle of state sovereignty, was more or less formed by consensus after the end of the 30 Years' War through the Treaty of Westphalia. The kingdoms agreed to refrain from meddling in other kingdoms' affairs, especially with regard to which religious tradition would be followed. The Treaty of Westphalia also accompanied the defeat of the Habsburg dynasty in Europe and paved the way for smaller communities to form states. The Treaty of Westphalia also contains the infancy of international law, as expectations and standards for toleration of other countries' religions was a core principle. The principle of sovereignty was thus established, and states could rule themselves, but war nonetheless continued on the continent. These religious wars in Europe and the emergence of consolidated power in states fueled the first era of colonization, with the exploration of the Americas for minerals, agricultural goods, and free labor, which commenced to assist in enriching the Spanish throne and helping it battle against its neighbors in the continent of Europe. The ongoing religious wars, which included the famous Inquisitions in Spain to expel Jews and Muslims, led to brutal tactics being exported to the new colonies, and indigenous populations were met with genocide, rape, torture, and the destruction of their empires. The longest-lived empire was the Ottoman Empire, which broke up as a result of the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. By the end of World War II, the majority of these colonies would become independent, and today only a handful of colonies are kept in legal trust by their former colonial masters. This includes Grenada, some Caribbean states, and some Southeast Asian territories. The first phases of colonization were completed by Spain, France, Portugal, and the Netherlands, while the U.S., Russia, and Japan formed colonies in the 19th and 20th centuries. The European approach to colonization carried notions that the people there were subjugated needed religion and civilization while ignoring ancient social structures and government that already existed. The rush to colonize Asia and Africa began pretty much as Latin America was nearing its independence, ushering in a second wave of colonization. In all cases, European states occupied far-off territories and subjugated the land and the people occupying it for wealth and natural resources. The exceptionalism of European colonization lies in the fact that the power structures and economic issues faced in these countries today reflect these earlier colonial experiences. An important feature of state building is the principle of national self-determination. This is the belief that all people have a right to determine where they live and how they are governed. Drawing from the ideals set out in the French Revolution, German and French nationalism held that sovereignty did not reside in the government but in the people. Nationalism is also an important principle that motivated anti-colonial struggles for independence. Loyalty and preference for one's own nation has been known to become heightened post-independence if there are power vacuums and no state structure is built by the local population. Therefore, nationalism plays an important role in state building, but it also has negative connotations. Nations may conflict with one another over the appropriate formation of government or occupation of certain territories, leading to massive civil unrest. Examples include Palestinians and Jews in Israel, Europeans and Roma throughout Europe, and the expulsion of the Rohingya Muslims from Myanmar. These nations and identities have taken an interesting pan-identity form in some cases, as populations from certain nations have become more and more spread out around the world. This form of connectedness to a culture and people territorially removed is an extreme example of how nations do not require territories. Empires, then, seem to have expired as a form of political organization, giving way to a preference for states. However, some argue that the process of forming empires, known as imperialism, has merely taken a new form. Instead of creating illegal ownership of foreign territories, powerful countries use military and economic measures to enforce their will on foreign territories, effectively creating new colonies. Sometimes this is referred to as neocolonialism. The United States is accused of being imperialist and attempting to have undue influence over other countries' political and economic systems. The U.S. has used military and economic power to establish itself as the dominant power, or the hegemon, in the world system. And some theories that we will discuss hold that hegemons create stability and prevent war. The United States actually began to occupy this position in the world system after World War II, when the European superpowers had become financially and physically broken. Whether or not the United States will remain in this position is a matter of intense debate and anxiety for some, especially as China seems poised to overtake us economically. There are 195 countries in the United Nations today. This includes 193 states and 2 non-member observer states, the Holy See and the State of Palestine. In 1945, there were 51 members of the United Nations. This change reflects the true underlying nature of politics, and especially of geopolitics, and that is one of change.